and we're going to have an interactive discussion among the panelists and also with all of you. And I wanted, based upon, since he actually left the door open to do it, I was going to ask David Wright to start off, because he was specifically asking for feedback on the idea of overturning the, well, however, what's the word you wanted to use, David? The ORI policy. Superseding the 1994 ORI plagiarism working definition with the 2005,
2005, yes.
definition. So perhaps you could say a bit more, while people are thinking about what their other questions are, what you think about the impact of overturning or superseding that earlier different definition, working definition. How would that change what happens in an important way for the community, for the research community?
Let me see if I can characterize it really in a nutshell, what's at issue here. When the 1994 policy was issued, we had a regulation that did not define misconduct, and it was really issued as a working definition. The 2005 regulation has a clear definition of misconduct, and therefore the question is the old quote-unquote policy, which is really just a working definition, pertinent or necessary anymore? So that's the question in a nutshell. So what would happen? I suspect that these things work out over time as the research institutions get more used to, what's going on at the agencies. But I suspect that we would get more allegations of plagiarism. Would we handle them differently? We might, this is speculation at this point, end up being somewhat more aggressive than we have been in the past. But some of what used to be a threshold that was articulated specifically as kinds of exclusions might still exist at some level in terms of significance. Mm-hmm. And we probably, for the reasons articulated in that earlier process, would not likely, but that's not a categorical exclusion, but not usually take on disputes amongst authors. Mm-hmm. So.
Okay. Maybe I can start the questioning so that I can encourage other people to stand up. But David, as an administrator at a university sort of overseeing research misconduct allegations, you can imagine which side of the fence I would fall on this, and clearly it would be helpful, I think, for the institutions if the 1994 component were to disappear, so that we would be more in line with the definition that you now give for research misconduct. What would you see as other than the fact that you may have to employ more people to do, to oversee cases, what would be the downside, in your opinion, of just doing that?
Excuse me, could you just spell out in a bit more detail what you mean by, for people who are not that familiar with the different regulations? I'm thinking of trainings.
Well, as David said, in the original 1994 policy, the definition of plagiarism was not well described in such detail as it is in the more recent, I forget what year it is, in the more recent policy.
It's just words.
Exactly. So as the institutions are overseeing potential allegations of plagiarism, they are obviously following the more recent guidelines. But then, as David said, there could be occasion whereby the institution then finds an individual or a group of individuals potentially guilty of plagiarism under those rules, but that ORI would say that we're not going to have that finding because they're still going by their 1994. That's, I think, what you spelled out in your talk a little bit. And so that brings a situation where the institutions who are following what they're being told is now the guidelines, and having a finding that then disagrees with the finding of ORI, which is not ideal. So I'm just asking if the 1994 policy were to be disregarded by ORI, and you just followed the more recent definitions of plagiarism, would that not be the better way to move forward?
Yeah, we'll have to come up with a term for euthanizing the old policy that everybody can agree with. Right now, we have the complex situation where we have a definition developed under an old regulation that didn't specify what plagiarism was, that at least deserves very careful scrutiny to see whether it complies with, the old policy complies with the new definition. The new definition is the regulation. I think, and this is still very preliminary, and before we take that step, want to talk to lots and lots of people and hear about it. In some ways, it looks to me at a preliminary stage like it would be cleaner to simply rely on the definition that's in the current regulation as opposed to the old gerrymandered attempt to replace or create a definition that wasn't in the regulation. It would be an evolutionary process, in my view, and Jim will want to speak to this too. We're still getting used to the new OSTP definition of plagiarism, much broader. When I first saw it, and I saw that it included plagiarism of ideas, I thought, here we go. You know, those are very, very difficult things. And in patent law cases, it's a whole legal specialty to determine out who invented what and what proportion of inventorship goes to whom. And we have not made a finding about plagiarism of processes yet. We've debated one. I was thinking when Jim was talking about the use of the criterion of carelessness, I don't think, it may be that I'm seriously deficient in not knowing my own regulation, but I don't think we have carelessness as a standard. But we have not made a finding on recklessness yet. We've come close, but we have done it.
Yeah, so in case I wasn't clear before, careless is not an intent upon which you can make a finding of research misconduct. It's the only one that you can't.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I may not have made it clear on that, but I brought in careless because careless and reckless use that same sort of reasonable person standard. The main difference being that whether or not the act was a significant departure from what a reasonable person would do.
I probably wasn't listening carefully enough, sorry.
Oh,
In any event,
I don't remember whether I did or not.
just to finish up, I think we have to look very hard. I think we probably ought to see if we can think of a reason why we shouldn't simply rely on the definition in the new regulation.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I don't see why you can't. I mean, you're always going to, I mean, all agencies, any organization always has the issue of resources and how much they can devote to it. So even if you default back to the definition from OSTP, that doesn't mean you're going to pursue a lot of stuff. You may, because we ran we ran an extensive. I mentioned in my talk that we proactively select a few proposals every year to look at, usually a few hundred. But 2 years ago, we looked at every 2011 proposal. Every 2011 proposal that was awarded. And we found that the plagiarism rate was 1%. Well, out of 8,000 proposals, that's 80 cases that we potentially generated. And the bottom line is that would have swamped us with, 5 or 6 investigators with what we already had in the pipeline. And so we actually had to change. We had to say, okay, we hit a cut line and we said, below this, we can't look at it now because we're just going to drown ourselves. And you have so many more data fabrication cases.
Yeah.
And those are ones that you have to put a lot of effort into often.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that police do all the time. I mean,
Right.
It's a kind of triage
Right,
function.
exactly, it's triage.
Right here.
Hi, I'm from the graduate school of Weill Cornell Medical College. One of my jobs is to help our graduate students to prepare for fellowship applications. And I have one question. Like in NIH 31 application, there is a question asking, I think the meaning is like, do you also submit other applications concurrently? So, students, in order to increase the success rate, they may submit more than one application at like almost at the same time, not exact same time, like NSF is November, NIH is December. So the application may not exactly the same, but the main idea may be the same. So how should the students handle this situation? Should they, what I'm thinking is, if they say yes, if they put yes, does that mean, let's say, NIH will not consider this application at all, or it's okay? So they will just know, okay, you also submit the similar application to NSF, something like that.
Let me see, make sure, are you speaking to me? Is that the question
I
directed to me?
think, yeah.
Okay.
I would like to get, calm
Okay.
opinion.
So the first thing that I should say, which I would be beating her up about the head and shoulders if I didn't, is I don't speak for NSF. ORI is not part of NSF, although we have jurisdiction over the grants that NSF makes.
You mean
So-
NIH?
Or, I'm sorry, NIH. Sorry. Now I'm going to get in more trouble. NIH, I meant to say. So, so I don't know, but I would speculate as a former professor who advised students that if you're going to submit more than one proposal, as students must in the necessary competition to get funding, and you answer truthfully that yes, you've submitted it, I don't think that counts against you. In the review process, you could include a little explanation if you wanted to of what the other proposal was and to where it was going, but I think unless there's some prohibition in the instructions that I don't know about, that you can only submit one proposal to one place at a time, which would surprise me, then I don't see a problem.
Yeah, and well, you're talking about graduate fellowships?
Yeah.
Because that's a separate program at NSF. And I think the main reason why the government may ask you that question is they want to make sure that if it's going to another agency, that they coordinate with their counterparts at that agency to make sure that the same proposal is not getting funded twice. Now, I can say that within NSF proper, biology is the only directorate where you cannot submit the same proposal to bio and the same proposal to NIH. NSF, the bio group, has that rule. But I know that the bio group and the folks at NIH are talking all the time, and it's not uncommon for program officers at both locations to say, hey, listen, we both have an interest in this science. We say we go 50-50, 60-40, something like that, split funding. I'll fund this piece of it, you fund that piece of it. And the great news is both agencies get, some of the glory in the end. It's actually a good way of doing business. But yeah, if you're submitting it to another agency, you need to check that block.
This is a really good example of the differences between proposals and papers, so that a manuscript is serving a different function than a proposal. So it's really important, as you're doing, to be clear about how they're different here.
Okay, then students also ask me if that's okay, because they say if I send two proposals to different agencies, and let's say usually it won't happen, but if it do happen, like both agencies says, we will fund your proposals, at that time they will tell the agencies that, well, I also get another award, so I only can choose one, something like that. Is that acceptable or not?
It's more acceptable than taking money from both agencies, I can tell you that much. That'll get you in a world of trouble really fast. Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to speak. I can't, just like David can't talk for NIH, I can't really talk for NSF, but I can tell you anecdotally that, if you apply for a graduate fellowship with NSF and NIH and you decide to take the NIH one, I don't think NSF, I'm looking, I have a friend of mine who's a program officer up there in the back, and I'm suspecting that NSF would not, you know, worry about that. They're just going to go to the next person, you know. They were able to fund these proposals. Well, if this one isn't going to be funded, they're able to go down and give that money to the next person. So I don't think there's any negative, there's no downside to it.
Okay, thank you.
But one of the things that this does highlight is that is really important for anyone who's making an application to a study section, to a particular group, subset of an agency, to be in touch with the program director in that particular section and make sure that there's a good match between their proposal and the particular interests of that directorate, so that, because the ultimate goal is to make sure that the limited funds that are out there gets dispersed in the most productive way. So, of course, the only thing that's really bad is if the student really wants to get 2 grants for the same thing, then they shouldn't tell. But that, of course, is the unethical point. So the real goal is to make sure that they get enough money to do the work, and if different agencies can provide the funding for it, then that's working together, which is presumably what we all kind of want.
Yes, but the difficult point to distinguish, like, whether this is the same proposal or not is one is NIH proposal, the fellowship proposals requires much more materials and more broad, you know, you need more data. And like NSF fellowship application, the proposal bar is very short, very general. So in this case, so how students can tell like whether they are submitting the same. So same, I know it's not the same, but whether it's a similar can be.
In the end, you want to look at the research aims. If the research aims are identical, those are identical proposals.
So it doesn't matter about the
Yeah, no, it
specific-
doesn't matter whether you know, one has data in it, one doesn't. If you're asking for money to do the same thing from 2 agencies, in essence, that's the same proposal.
Okay, so
At least that's the way I look at it.
Okay, so the aim is the research aim,
Yeah.
goal is more important.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Alan Evelyn. I'm a Rio here at CUNY, and the observation I want to make is that my experience, which I think is bared out in the literature, is that most of the calls or inquiries that I get as a Rio are petty. This is just petty. Just faculty jealousy, or they're, you know, the conversation starts, Johnny stole my stuff, and when you get in the office, there's just no validity to this. And so, as a practicing Rio, as you want to expand the concept of plagiarism, the calls go up, and there's just going to be more sort of pettiness. And so that as we look at codifying definitions or moving, I think that Rios would appreciate guidance. And so I'm fearful that because it's convenient, we want to use 2 sentences when 10 pages is really necessary in order to make my job sort of feasible. And I think that's the comment that I want to make is that as we move to sort of try to address this problem in a broader way, that you consider the Rio's time and effort in trying to make this happen on campuses, because it gets to a point where you just can't do it anymore because you're just sort of sick of Johnny stole my stuff, and there's just nothing to it other than jealousy or other personal issues. Thank you.
Personally, I'm not sure changing the definition is going to change that. I don't know. I mean, it may expand the number that you get, but the federal definition is still out there.
Yeah, the federal definition is the definition that has the force of law, of course. The question for us is, does the 94 definition conflict with it in any way? Is it still pertinent? Does it still serve a useful purpose? As to guidance, that's a very complicated thing in the federal government, and a process that is fraught with all kinds of politics and both bureaucratic and professional. What we have done at ORI is to convene meetings of RIOs. That we call them RIO boot camps, but we've done now 14 of them, and we bring together RIOs from all over the country, and we talk about basic best practices, but they do a fair amount of the teaching. ORI staff do some, and we discuss these problems ourselves to see what's the consensus in the community, which we think is probably better than having the feds dictate. So maybe we should do that. Maybe we should include a section on plagiarism and the definition in one of those meetings or multiple meetings. I'll consider that. Thank you.
I'm not unsympathetic to your pain, because there's many days I feel more like a divorce lawyer than an investigator. I understand exactly where you're coming from. Some of the allegations are so far out in left field, and when some people, when they've been wronged, they can't let it go. Even when multiple people tell them, there's just no basis for this.
Sure.
It happens.
There's the repeat customers.
Looking for frequent flyer miles?
Yes.
Good afternoon. I'm Kevin Nesbitt. I'm here from John Jay College as the Academic Integrity Officer. So first, I'd love to thank our panelists for a wonderful, illuminating conversation. You brought breadth to this topic, but also from a variety of perspectives that I particularly appreciate. Besides being the Academic Integrity Officer, I also manage the faculty personnel process for the President and Provost. So while subconsciously I always see the connections for faculty and students in these academic integrity issues, it's not always explicit in my work. So this was very helpful to think about the explicit nature when you talked about this culture for faculty around these research integrity issues, and also for students. I have two sort of, I guess, questions or ideas I wanted to explore with you. And I wrote them down so I'm not accused of plagiarizing here. So let me see. Let me remember what it is that I was hoping to ask you. So in one of the earlier presentations, we talked about this notion of the covert and the overt. And this idea that that when we look at publishing houses and journals, there's this lack of respect when you overtly say, this was my idea. I wrote about this twice before. This is now the third iteration of it as I deepen my knowledge in this field. And now I'd like you to consider this work as something you'd like to publish. So I guess my explicit question is, as when we think about intentionality, and we think about the fact that there is intentionality in this covert act at times because of all the pressures to publish, is there a move that you see anywhere out there in terms of journals? And thinking about the value that Dr. Bird brought to this conversation about communication, that the real goal is we want to communicate. Are there journals or publishing houses that are still reputable, that are starting to understand or say overt is okay? It's okay to say explicitly, this is not a brand new idea, that this is a form of idea you're expanding on, that you've written about it before, and are starting to find it's valuable in terms of the overall goal here in science, communicating and continuing to advance knowledge. So that's the first question, and then maybe I can ask the second one, which is a little bit easier. Yeah.
Give you an example of what reality versus what the editors and publishing houses do. So on the one hand, it's well known, as Jim pointed out, that if you want to take someone else's verbatim text, you want to enclose it in quotation marks and give a citation. Well, I would ask, when was the last time, let's say in the biomedical literature, where you saw a quoted portion of somebody else's material? In other words, what happens in reality is that there's an expectation that you are going to be able to summarize, paraphrase other people's work. I mean, there's this convention that if you're going to take somebody else's verbatim text, you should put it in quotation marks. But apparently what the practice is, and I'm guilty of doing this, if I see too much of that, I would call it something like inappropriate scholarship where you're overly quoting someone else, for example. So to get back at your original question, the publishing houses want original material, original ideas, and so on and so forth. On the one hand, you have a responsibility to your readers, to science in general, to be honest. And unfortunately, those two clash, because if you're going to say that this idea, I've had this idea in the past, I've published this idea in the past, or these data in the past, the journals are not going to be interested in it because it's not original, it's not new stuff. And so there's that tension. On the one hand, you're expected to be honest about the originality of your work, but on the other hand, and you also want to, there's this wish to disseminate your ideas and your data in as wide as possible audience, but journals are adamant about wanting just original stuff, never been published before. Hope I answered your question.
You have answered the question. I guess there just seems to be a disconnect from the respect that we sort of move towards in the academy for deepening an agenda which often relies on prior work, but also your own work, and then also this hope for original publications, and there seems to still be a disconnect. The other, and I guess easier question, which may be sort of a comment, and Dr. Bird raised this, in terms of when so my field is political science, for example, and so I guess it feels much more slippery because often you write articles, but you often write books in terms of what you're relying on as prior work. But when Dr. Bird raised the issue of, so you're writing something as a psychologist, but you're also writing it as for an audience of sociologists, and that this might be, they may be two works that come from the same set of data or come from similar ideas, but they end up resulting in something that might be two different publications, and that we have to think of it that way. I guess I find that interesting and appealing, but I find concern because I've had colleagues that use translations in the same way or talk about translations in the same way, where this is really for a different audience. And we've all read translations of things written in other languages, and it is, at times they're markedly different, and there's sort of this stake that this is an entirely different work, an entirely set way of thinking just to present it, and at other times we discredit it. So I guess it's just an interesting sort of departure to say, okay, well, if I'm writing for the sociologists and the psychologists, it's different. Well, I'm writing it for native speakers and non-native speakers. So it's more of a comment, and maybe more that Dr. Burke can sort of speak to.
Well, I think a translation is a different audience in a different way. So I don't think changing the jargon is necessarily the same as a translation. But it's certainly, if you've written, or if your colleagues as a group of co-authors, or if you, as a single person, have written a paper on a particular topic for different audiences, of course it makes all the sense to both, you're taking the data, but you're going to be highlighting different things because the main point is going to be slightly different, or maybe greatly different, because the bottom line, the significance for the different communities is really different. And you want them to take away either perhaps related but different ideas, because that's what they're going to be building on. But it certainly is entirely appropriate to reference the other paper.
Yes.
Certainly for people who are going through the literature and trying to find out what are the papers relevant to this topic, and might be coming from even a third different perspective and want to find out from different perspectives, different disciplinary perspectives, this particular topic, what's being said about that. So I think it's really important, I think Miguel made the point earlier, just be upfront about where people will find something similar and something different. Personally, I find it really aggravating to find nothing different when I go to the same person's papers, different papers on the same topic, because I'm thinking, well, this person will have expanded more on the topic or the idea, and if they don't, that can be frustrating, but at least you know that they're referring to the same kind of topic, and you can build on it. It's really more to let the community know what it is, where it is that they should be investing their time, people who are trying to follow up on your work. The other point I was going to make, though, is that about this idea of publishing houses and editors and that kind of thing. I think one of the things that it's really worthwhile to do is, on the one hand, as an editor, I expect that authors will know where their work sits in the larger literature. And so it's essential to demonstrate that that's true and that this is what the general field looks like and these are the main ideas and this idea has been expressed before and people have written on it with these kinds of perspectives or evaluations, and I've written on it in the past, with a different perspective, and then build on it. But it's always important to both show how it's moving the idea forward. If you're just restating what's already in the literature, you're really not serving the community. But if you're building on something, then you really need to lay a foundation. I think each paper has, in some respect, has to be able to stand on its own so that someone picking it up understands why this is important. Obviously, a novice is not going to get the same thing out of it as somebody who's steeped in the field, but you want to be able to pick something up and then move forward with it by putting it in the larger context of the field.
Thank you.
Hi.
Oh, yes, okay, you were there first.
My name is Juan de la Cruz. I'm from Lehman College, Department of Economics and Business. I became very interested in the topic of plagiarism recently. And I want to ask you a question. And basically, your presence here at the Graduate Center at CUNY makes exactly the point I am trying to make. In cases of plagiarism, it's always good to be proactive, bringing people with the knowledge who can inform us on the pros and on the cons and the consequences for plagiarism helps a lot. And in particular, if we are considering CUNY, which is an institution with that has a wide range of skills, diversity, what are examples that you can give us of proactive approaches to fight this problem, which is plagiarism?
Having policies is not enough. You can have the most explicit university policy, and if that's all you have, if you're not going to promulgate it, if you're not going to have workshops about the different aspects of the policy, it's just going to not be very effective. To answer your question, I would direct you to an article by Don McCabe, who is considered the dean of academic dishonesty, in terms of what institutions can best do to stop academic dishonesty. Of course, includes all kinds of other types of cheating, but you need to combat plagiarism in any kind of academic dishonesty. You have to put the message out there. And this can take a variety of forms. Have lectures, have workshops, make sure that every faculty member provides has a plagiarism policy. Make sure that every faculty member instructs their students about his or her expectations as to what constitutes plagiarism or not. And it should be universal, right? Plagiarism is plagiarism, but the fact is that different faculty members have different thresholds of how much text can be reused without attribution. Whether it's 3, 4 consecutive words versus 7 consecutive words, if this is a full sentence. So I think it's important to attack the problem from a variety of ways. And just to give an example, again, in the area of academic dishonesty in general, McCabe and others have promoted the idea of establishing honor codes where students sign a formal document, and so on. But again, honor code, if this is a one-time deal, it's just not going to be very effective. This is the sort of thing that has to be inculcated time and again. There has to be, I want to see banners everywhere where conveying the message that, number one, this is a big deal to us, and that it should be a big deal to you as well. Because oftentimes especially with students, one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that their students plagiarize is that they don't know how to write. It's as simple as that. I mean, it's a language problem, and not just because of them being, English not being their primary language. I mean, I can tell you how many native speakers who can't string two sentences together.
I can tell you, it's an endless number.
So it has to be a multi-pronged effort, and there's no simple solution. And to be even very specific about this, I mean, one of the things I do is in every class, I put up a paragraph and I rewrite it in a variety of ways. I mean, this is part of when I give workshops on these issues, this is how I do it. Okay, so here's an example where it's inappropriately paraphrased and summarized. Here's an example where it is. Here's where the best way to use a citation, and so on and so forth. It's a process, and it's not a simple one. And it takes practice to sort of assimilate these principles.
Yeah, at NSF, I agree completely. That's got to be a multi-pronged thing. But we've had a mantra for the last few years, going back to when Peggy was still there, Peggy Fisher. Tone at the top. What is the head shed saying? And the tone at the top can be the president of the university. The tone at the top could be the dean of the college. The tone at the top could be the department chair. In fact, it should be all three of them. That's where it starts. Make it clear. But then I also think you do have groups that are at risk. Certainly, almost a lot of graduate students, whether they're English as second language or not, and certainly young faculty members, and that's where mentoring comes in. I think that's something we see as distinctly lacking, is any sort of mentoring system within the universities nowadays.
There's a school of thought to which I assent, that when the research director of whatever group, the lab chief, or if it's social sciences, the research director, looks at the grant proposals and publications that leave that group, she or he actually reads them, and at the same time looks at the raw data that support them, the likelihood that a paper that's plagiarized or misconduct is going to leave the lab is dramatically reduced. And well, I'll stop there.
But of course, one of the challenges, if you have a really big lab, then there are a lot of people. So there is this time constraint, and that's, I think, one of the things that argues against too many people, then it's possible to supervise. But I think that the tone at the top is a really important part of it. But even with the idea of the honor code, I noticed recently that a colleague at Wheaton College has in her syllabus that every student, when submitting a paper, has to write that this conforms with the Wheaton Code, Honor Code. And that really is consistent with the literature that shows that when individuals are asked to explicitly consider the Honor Code before they participate in some activity where that could be violated, that it really serves to reinforce in their own immediate conduct better behavior. It's kind of wonderfully effective. So that certainly seemed like a really interesting and effective, I guess, implementation of that strategy. I don't know how it works for her, but it certainly is an interesting idea. So 2 questions over here, and then Farida, and then I think we might be.
Is conscious intent always part of findings or determination of plagiarism? In other words, should we always take into consideration, can you plead ignorance? Can you plead and say, I forgot, I didn't really know? What about formulas? Everybody use E is equal to MC squared. It's so open, do you have to attribute, especially what happened in mathematics and technology? Some of the ideas are just formulas now. Should you always try to go back to the original sources? And if you determine against somebody, should you always take into the account their intent? Was it deliberate, or should you just say it's plagiarism because they copied the work and they did not do it?
That's why there's 4 possible intents. The knowing and intentional is more in the category that you were kind of referring to, where they knew that it was wrong and they did it with a purposeful act. And then you have that issue of what a reasonable person in that position would have known. And that becomes a tougher judgment. There's no doubt about it. And whether or not the act was substantive or not. We actually had a situation, we had a case that involved a Chinese professor who came over from China to Virginia University, was put in a soft money position, and of course in soft money positions you have to write proposals to get your salary. They knew that he did not have a particularly strong command of the English language, and his first proposal to NSF was excessively plagiarized. The agency did make a finding of research misconduct. They didn't take particularly strong action against him because the situation, his personal situation, was mitigated. But we also went back to the school and kind of looked over our glasses and said, what the heck are you doing? Why would you take someone from a foreign country who has very limited English skills and put them in a position where the only way they can feed their family is to write proposals without any mentoring? I mean, if there had been some mentoring, there would have been, something else. But it's like throwing somebody to the wolves.
May I? This is a pet peeve of mine because others have made this point before. By the way, there's nothing original of mine ever, so please, anything I say, somebody else has said it, but I think it's been repeating right now, and I don't know who said it, so sorry, I can't give proper attribution. But it's the, it's the fact that American institutions routinely accept students who are expected to write at a certain level, but who cannot. And why they are accepted, it's somewhat complicated. But this is a real problem. And so I just wanted to make that comment that too often we put students in very difficult positions because we accept them under certain conditions, and now we expect them to perform at a level which they are incapable of when it comes to writing.
Well, let me just make one quick follow-up. The question I'm really asking is, would any of you accept the excuse, look, I just forgot, or I really didn't remember where the source came from? Would you accept that as a valid excuse for somebody you are trying to find a determination of
I have to respond. It really depends on the type of plagiarism that we're talking about here. Personally, whenever I see text reuse of any kind, it's not a matter of memory. I mean, oh, but I forgot to put a citation. No, you didn't proofread. Plagiarism of the notion of memory lapses, of inadvertent plagiarism, is something that's been shown in the psychological literature. It's called oh dear, I forgot the term, but it's just talk about a memory lapse. It's at the tip of my tongue too, but it's a well-known phenomenon in psychology that we often forget the source of our ideas. That it's possible. But that's for ideas. For text, listen, when you read something, you know if it came from you or someone else, especially if your writing skills are not well developed. So I would not accept, personally, in my classes or as a reviewer or what have you, I would not accept I forgot a memory excuse for a text plagiarism.
Yeah, and I think you have to remember, from my perspective, I'm not talking about undergraduate students. I'm talking about people that are submitting proposals to NSF, which are usually faculty members. Do I believe that someone could have cut and pasted and forgotten and gone back to edit it? Sure, definitely. But that falls under the category of reckless, because a reasonable person would have remembered to go back and paraphrase that stuff. So that's where that definition of that intent comes back, in my opinion.
And certainly, I think this is the point, to some extent, we're dealing with the problems that are of our own making that we actually recognize. That is, you can't really supervise 50 students well. You can't really expect to import people for whom English is not their first language and expect them to write well and communicate well. So we have these problems that are really a reflection of not explicitly addressing pretty obvious kinds of problems. So at some level, at a teaching level, when you get from a student a paper that has clearly a paragraph or two or three where there's no reference and you know that they didn't come up with this data and they can't be coming out of this, this concept themselves, then if they don't have it there, then you say, well, this paper is not done until you go and track down where this idea came from. So this is your opportunity to provide, it's a teachable moment, I think.
Just one more addition. In addition, I think it's worth saying that in addition to the intentional, knowing, and reckless, that the regulation includes the statement that honest error does not constitute misconduct. And when you get down to the low end of the continuum, to the reckless standard, most committees can go back and forth between could whatever the act is, plagiarism, falsification, fabrication, be honest error, or could it be recklessness? It's a very hard choice, but so there's one more element that's usually debated.
Good point. Good point.
Thanks.
Okay.
I'm Bill Bernhardt from the College of Staten Island. I'm not a member of the scientific community, but I do have a long experience as a teacher of composition and as a former co-editor of a journal, peer-reviewed journal in the humanities. And I think one of the things that's very clear to me from what's been said today, that there really is a double standard in dealing with students and professionals, faculty. When I was editing the journal, we had nothing like Turnitin.com or Safe Assign that the faculty at CUNY use routinely now for their students. Maybe if we had, we would have discovered the overlap between articles, written by the same person. And as far as I know, journals don't have things like that today, although I might not be up to date. But I think another issue that I've also suddenly caught my attention here is that as the editor of a journal, we often wanted to attract authors who could publish anywhere they wanted to. We wanted to get them to publish in our journal, and we wanted them in a way to say the same thing in our journal that they had already said in some even more prestigious journal. And so if we did notice the overlap, we kind of, closed our eyes to it because people were going to want to read that article to see the person repeating pretty much what they had already done in another article, maybe applying the same principle to different data or something like that. So I think these are all very, very complicated issues, not only in the ways that all of the panel have pointed out, but in other ways that I feel stimulated by today's event to think about.
And that makes a good point. I mean, different journals, different organizations can have flexible standards, let's put it that way. And one of the things when we refer a matter to an institution, we make it very clear that when you're investigating this, we want you to look at X, Y, and Z for us. But in the end, when you're making a decision about what action to take, it really needs, those actions shouldn't be to protect the federal government. We'll take action if we think it's appropriate. The actions that the institution should take should be to protect the interests of the institution. And we see a wide range. I mean, the University of Delaware has a zero tolerance policy. I mean, I've seen faculty members fired over 20 lines of plagiarism, which is not a lot. But they have a zero tolerance policy. That's the way they want to do it. Okay, that's fine. Other institutions have different policies. They have to do what they think is in the interest of protecting the academic integrity of their institution. We never, and I don't think ORI would ever, tell an institution what they need to do. So,
Yeah.
Wait. Kryptonesia.
We knew you'd get it. But what's the source of that?
Okay, I have more of a scholarly question, which is, Miguel, you pointed a little bit about on the issue of meta-analysis research having an impact on plagiarism. A lot of times when you read about issues related to plagiarism, most of them have to do with the quality of the research, the contribution to the scientific community, the individuals' professional endeavors, those types of things. Meta-analysis research is not often mentioned, though I can see that it usually is used a lot in research that makes policy recommendations and has an impact on policy making. So can you comment a little bit more on the impact that plagiarism might have on this type of meta-analysis research, especially in terms of whether it's, how much it's used in policy making, if at all, and what kind of an effect that might have?
Well, in terms of, the issue is, again, plagiarism of data. This is where plagiarism or self-plagiarism of data. And I think I had shown that one slide by study by Tramer, who had, if my memory serves me, essentially he carried out a meta-analysis with a known duplicate so with a duplicate and without a duplicate, and found that a single duplicate can alter the results of a meta-analysis, therefore, affecting whatever recommendations, policy, and so on and so forth. So something like, plagiarized data, whether it's plagiarized or self-plagiarized, and of course I'm talking covertly, in other words, people are misled about about its originality, is extremely dangerous. And this is why I say it is equivalent to fabricated data. These are data that do not exist. And so, and this is why I think it's important to make these kinds of clarifications even in conferences, because most meta-analysis do meta-analyses of published studies, but not all. Some of them include, because the studies may only exist in proceedings form, let's say. And so it's important to, anytime we disseminate data, to clarify its origin, and mainly because of meta-analysis.
But I think that one of the things that this really highlights that really is important and builds on that is that if the process, the methods of meta-analysis have such a possibility of flaw, that is, if the people who do the meta-analysis take the shortcut and say, well, here's different groups of numbers from all these different publications and we can put them all together in the same pot, without actually doing the work of making sure that half these numbers haven't been aren't duplicates of the other half, then one can really ask the question whether the process of meta-analysis needs some really serious rethinking, especially since meta-analysis does serve as the foundation for certain public policy decisions and in healthcare and treatment recommendations and that kind of thing.
That's a known, it's well known that that is a flaw, but my perspective is that in science, we're taught to be, again, transparency. We're taught to be honest. Method sections, they have to be excruciatingly exact and so on and so forth. Well, we should have that same mentality toward data. Make sure that it's not, listen, I should not be put in the position to have to determine whether, to question the legitimacy, the originality of data. If it's published, I'm going to assume that it's original. So this is why these kinds of behaviors, duplication, covert duplication, salamis, and so on and so forth, are dangerous.
Yeah, we actually have a case that we're sending forward to the agency here in the near future. Now, it's not really meta-analysis, but the case involved plagiarism and the copying of 3 figures from other sources without acknowledgement, well, without proper acknowledgement. 2 of the figures in the text where the figures are described, there is a citation to the source, although it doesn't make it clear that the figure came from the source. But in the 3rd figure, in the descriptor, the text description of the figure, it makes no reference to anything. And it really sounds, the way the paragraph reads, it sounds like this was my, preliminary research. Although the author didn't come out and explicitly say that. But we're actually going forward to the agency with a recommendation of plagiarism on the text. It's pretty obvious. But on that figure, we're floating to them the notion that we think that's data fabrication, because he basically taking the data and making it sound like, yeah, this is mine, when it wasn't.
Last question, what do you think?
I'm glad I got it. I'm Roseanne Flores, and I'm a developmental psychologist, but I have a different kind of question. So a question who uses large data sets, federally funded data sets from NCES, and also now that we're in the age of big data, so that's what the Office of Science and Technology wants you to do. So therefore, the methods aren't going to change. In fact, NCES says when you're using large data sets, here it is. You're really not going to, embellish on the ECLSK. This is how we collected it. This is how you need to describe it. So when you then go to read journal articles, those method sections look pretty much the same. You're going to describe them at 50% and 250. So how do you deal with that? Because, in a sense, you're taking NCESs or the data, or when we're using big data now, because everybody wants to use it, we're using those words. You really can't tweak them or change them too much, but you're going to see those things over and over and over again in people's publications. So how would you deal with that?
And so if that popped on our scope, we would pick up on that. We actually have had a couple cases not dealing with those particular databases, but dealing with other large research programs where the language that was identified by the software described that program. It was the official description of that program, and they had pulled that in, but the research was very heavily connected to that program, and we said, okay. You're good to go. I mean, each case is unique, and you have to take a look at it, but that falls under that category of technically constrained in our mind.
Okay, so I'm going to turn this. Okay, thank you.
So in closing, I'd like to say that I've been amazed by the level of discussion and enthusiasm for the topic of plagiarism. And I want to stress that what each one of us must do now is really share as broadly as possible the lessons that we've learned during the last 4 hours today. So I give that as an assignment to especially all the administrators here. And finally, once again, I would like to thank all of our speakers for what's been a very informative session. Thank you. And I wanted to thank all of you as well for attending. Have a great day.
Okay. That was good. That won't go up.